People, what's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? My mother-in-law's deepest secret was revealed to me, and I was better off not knowing. It was my mother-in-law's birthday yesterday, and in anticipation of her birthday, we celebrated with a small party on Saturday for family only. After almost a year of observing social distancing guidelines, my mother-in-law decided to ignore them for once and invited all of her family. She requested that if anybody feels sick, has a temperature, or just doesn't feel comfortable coming to her party, that it would be the best policy to stay home. My wife and I decided to go. It was a great time. There was food and drink. People were talking and laughing. It was nice. At some point during the party, however, the drinking got a little heavy. I decided to abstain from drinking any further as I was to be driving home that night, and one more beer was enough for me to be legally sober by the time it was time to head home. As with any family, politics was a sensitive subject, and when the direction of the general conversation shifted to politics, a large part of the group decided to go to the basement and the living room, play board games and video games. Naturally, I stayed in the kitchen because I love a good debate, and I was still eating. It was just me, my mother-in-law, her sister Laura, and her brother that remained. Somehow, we got on the subject of physical relations and the taboo and other things we heard about through media. It was a great conversation, but after so much drinking, Laura had to go to the bathroom, and she remained absent for a prolonged period of time. I was left alone now with my mother-in-law and her brother, and as we talked, they continued to drink. I don't know how we got there, but I found myself hearing out their confession to me that my mother-in-law and her brother had inappropriate relations in their adolescence in Mexico. What made it worse was that they spoke of it without regret. Only the understanding that it was wrong in the eyes of society was evident as they confessed this secret to me, but they spoke of it fondly. My mother-in-law confessed to me that she married my father-in-law when she was 20 because of a pregnancy scare. At the time, she was secretly afraid it may have been a result of a relapse into that relationship with her brother while she was dating my father-in-law. Fortunately, it bore no fruit, and they abandoned the practice. I left that night wishing I had just left to the other room when everyone else did. Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. 24 hours before my dad passed away from stage 4 lung cancer. He was in the ER and later moved to the ICU. Because of hospital COVID restrictions, we couldn't be with him. My mom, sister, and I spent the entire day texting and calling him, but we never got a response. My mom even contacted the hospital and spoke to one of his ICU nurses, who reassured her that he was awake and communicating just fine. At 3:30 a.m. the next morning, he passed quickly. By the time we were allowed to be at his bedside, he was already unconscious. We said our goodbyes, and then he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was on the phone with cremation services, arranging for his body to be picked up from the hospital. As I went through the bag of belongings they had returned to us, I found his phone. Wanting some comfort, I opened it to read through our last messages, only to find that none of them had been read. Not mine, not my mom's, not my sister's. At first, I assumed he had just been too weak to check them. Then I started scrolling through his apps and noticed a messaging app one had vaguely heard of before. When I opened it, I saw only one contact, a woman's name. Reading through the messages, I realized my dad had been talking to her nonstop, hour by hour, throughout his last day. As far back as I could scroll, they had been exchanging messages. He called her princess. He told her he loved her. She was worried about him, asking why he was in the ER, what was happening. It didn't take long to see that this wasn't just some acquaintance. This was, at the very least, an emotional affair. Grief was instantly replaced by shock and anger. A week later, I tracked the girl down and spoke to her through DMs. That's when I learned she was 19. She was 17 when they met. My dad, a 66-year-old man, had been dating a girl younger than his own grandchildren. She told me they had been together for almost 2 years. He had been her high school bus driver. In his final moments, he chose to be with her. He chose to say his last goodbyes to her, not to us. I hope it brought him some kind of happiness, but it left me with a truth I'll have to carry for the rest of my life. A truth that will forever overshadow my relationship with him. One I'll never get to confront him about. It's the one secret I wish I had never uncovered. Story 3. A few years after marrying my first wife, I realized she had been in an ongoing physical relationship with her first cousin before she met me. The moment of realization hit me while sitting around a campfire, just from the way they looked at each other. I always knew he was her favorite cousin, but I never suspected anything. Until that night. It was just the three of us, and I've always been good at reading people. Well, except the women I dated, lol. I caught a glance between them, and without a doubt, I just knew. So, I asked straight out, "When did you two first hook up?" She was so stunned that she admitted it instantly and said, "How did you know?" Then she immediately panicked. Oh God, I wonder if anyone else in the family figured it out. They had been sleeping together off and on for at least 2 years before I met her. But looking back, I suspect it continued after we got together. Oh, and another fun fact. She was bipolar and completely untreated, which she conveniently failed to mention before our marriage. Things got bad. I was lucky to walk away. I divorced her in 2014. As of last year, I told one of her female cousins, who absolutely hates her, so I'm sure the whole family knows by now. LOL. Story 4. My youngest brother, who was by all accounts a sweet, sensitive kid and had a V-card pledge with his girlfriend, turned out to be sleeping with his girlfriend's mom. He called her mom, and they ran off to get married after his girlfriend caught them in bed. He also got kicked out of the Army because his girlfriend's dad was an Army chaplain, and the Army frowns on officers sneaking other men's wives to bang on base. He was apparently given a few warnings about it too. Most of that we didn't find out until later because his story was that he was dropping out of high school in his senior year to live with his girlfriend's family until they were both 18 to get married. My parents tried to change his mind and took him to counseling until the counselor had a private session with him. The counselor said he was worried that my brother was going to hurt them or himself, so they let him go. A month or so after, he sent a letter saying he never wanted to hear from any of us ever again, and a few months after that is when crap hit the fan. His girlfriend caught him with her mother, and he got kicked out of the Army. When we cleared out his room, needed the space for a baby, we discovered a bunch of stuff that he had apparently stolen from us, and letters detailing how much he hated all of us, except me, who he only referred to as a lonely loser in one letter. Last we heard is that he is working at a Home Depot, got married to his ex-girlfriend's mom, moved in together, is thinking about electrician school, and is bitter that my parents aren't chasing after him despite being very clear he never wanted to see them again. My parents have been devastated but have chosen to respect that he doesn't want contact. All we've heard about him has been through mutual friends, his ex-girlfriend, and his mommy wife's Facebook. Story 5. Back in 2010, my brother and I stayed with our grandmother, Dad's mom, for the summer. 2 weeks after we got home, my grandma called my mom, furious, accusing me of stealing $7,000 from a safe she had. She demanded the money back. Of course, I had no idea what she was talking about, and I was completely clueless. Thankfully, my mom stood up for me, telling my grandma she didn't believe I took it and that there was no evidence pointing to me. My grandma refused to back down, though, insisting it had to be me. She told my mom I was never allowed back at her house and that she didn't want to see me again because the money was something she really needed. I didn't hear from her again until 2017 when I had my first child. Then, just earlier this year, I found out, surprise, it was my brother who took the money. But he was never accused, and he and my grandma stayed close while she cut me off for 7 years. Here's the real kicker. My grandma knew the truth in 2011, less than a year after the money went missing. But she never confronted my brother, never cut him off, and still kept me away for another 6 years. To this day, she's never apologized to me, nor has she ever talked to my brother about it. So, for 12 years, my entire dad's side of the family knew the truth, that it was my brother, but no one did anything. They all knew I was unfairly exiled from the family, but no one ever tried to bring me back or apologize. The innocent were left to bear the blame, and the guilty stayed free. Story 6. A lot to unpack with this one, but years ago, I discovered my father's stash of Korn DVDs, and honestly, I would have kept quiet about it had it not been mostly extreme ones with gay men. Anyway, this opened a giant can of worms. My mother confronted him, and it turned out that he'd been having random hookups with men and women for the last 10 years. Think that's all? Nope. One of those hookups was his own cousin who had a serious alcohol problem. He then used that hookup to blackmail the man into giving him money for years. There was absolutely no reason to do this. My dad had a fantastic job, which paid great money. Am I finished? Nope. My parents obviously split up, and then my dad became quite sick very shortly afterwards. It turned out that he had AIDS, which he contracted years prior, HIV, and knew about it all that time. Everyone in my family had to be tested, including my younger brother, who was only 12 at the time. Thankfully, and almost unbelievably, we all tested negative, including my mom. Surely I'm finished now? Nope. My dad met another woman and relapsed. He'd been off drugs for 12 years. Started drinking and doing drugs again. Lost his job, eventually lost the house he was staying in with her, and became homeless. Like, living on the street type homeless. And just one more thing. When they broke up, her 11-year-old daughter told her that my father had been essaying her. We all stood behind the family and gave statements to the police. This led to my brother also finding the courage to tell us that our dad also essayed him for a number of years. His laptop and phone were seized, and indecent images were found on them. And you know where he is now? Well, neither do we. The police literally knew where he was and were ready to make an arrest, but decided not to because it's a Sunday. That was a few years ago, and he's been hiding ever since. On the outside, this man was a professional guy with a great job, always very caring and charming. People loved him, and yet he's the biggest monster I've ever known. Hopefully he's gone for good. Story 7. My aunt was plotting to essay her underage grandson with a cop she met online dating. I've got a dozen aunts, and this one was, seemingly, the most mild-mannered and innocent one. I always felt bad for her because her daughter had a kid when she was young, and then her life went off the rails, and so my aunt got custody of her grandson when he was less than a year old. When he was around 9, my aunt left her husband and then started online dating. She was talking with a guy who was a cop. We later found out he had a history of befriending women with kids and then essaying their children. Anyways, my aunt definitely has some issues with men and wanting to feel wanted by men, so she went along with a lot of the sick stuff this cop was suggesting they'd do to her grandson. Would she have actually done it? I think so, but the opinion is split in my family, especially cause this aunt is typically such a goody two-shoes. Anyways, the cop ended up getting busted and went to prison, as he had done this with multiple women and children, and my aunt got sentenced for a felony conspiracy. She passed away of cancer not long after her sentencing. Story 8. My now husband, then fiancé, and I spent a couple of years teaching in rural Alaska. It was an intense but incredible adventure, full of lessons, both the ones we sought and the ones we didn't expect. During that time, we befriended a colleague, an older single man who seemed friendly and welcoming. We often had dinner together, went hiking, and even shot his gun collection at a local beach, using the school's Honda. Such was rural life, and no animals or local wildlife were harmed. He became like an uncle to us, and we even stayed at his Airbnb/spare bedroom in the city once while on vacation. In our second year, he introduced a young woman, claiming she was his niece. She never left his house, and he explained that she was struggling to live with his brother while taking online classes to graduate. She confirmed this to us and other women in the village. By spring, she left, and when people asked why, he said she had reconciled with her father and returned home. But the truth was far darker. She wasn't his niece at all. She was a girl he had met online, who wasn't even of legal age. Her father had been searching for her after she reached out to a local woman about her situation. A state trooper was sent to escort her home. She had been missing for 8 months. The messed up part? While facing court for this, he tried to coax another girl offline to come live with him the next school year. It turns out the entire chat history was part of an FBI sting operation. He's now in prison until 2043. Story 9. My father cheated on my brother's mother with my mom, though my mom didn't know at the time. They married, and I was born on their 1-year anniversary. Soon after, he started cheating on my mom with multiple women. Even when he went to visit his mother on her deathbed from cancer, he still found time to meet up with women. My mom and I went back to our home state while he stayed behind to bury his mom. After he left my mom, he remarried in Mexico to a woman the same age as my brother from his first marriage. He passed away in 2011 from a heart attack on the freeway, somehow managing to park the car before he died. When my brother and I went to pick up his things, we went through his phone. And surprise, he was cheating on his wife in Mexico. The contacts in his phone were labeled as his boss, lawyer, and a few other names. We went through the messages and, honestly, we weren't surprised at all. So, we did him one final favor and erased everything from his phone. He was a player until the very end. A scumbag, for sure, but from what I've heard, his past was even worse. But I'll save that for another post. Story 10. A good friend of mine was cheating on her boyfriend with 3 different guys, all in various parts of the country. She would fly out to LA for a work conference to see one of them, come back home, and then a month later, she'd take another trip, this time to Seattle, always with another excuse about work-related reasons. This went on for about 6 months, and she was juggling all these relationships without anyone in her life suspecting anything. She seemed to be getting away with it all, but things started to unravel. I had no idea about any of it until one day, I got a frantic call from her. She was in Phoenix, sitting in a Starbucks bathroom, absolutely hysterical. She told me she was stuck in a dangerous situation with one of the guys, and she thought he was either going to kidnap her or hurt her. I could hear how terrified she was, and my heart sank. I tried to calm her down and help her figure out a way to get out of there. Luckily, she managed to escape and catch a flight home safely. When she got back, her boyfriend immediately ended their relationship. He had no idea about her infidelity until then, and honestly, I think he was just devastated by the betrayal. After that, she faced a lot of judgment from our mutual friends. Most of them chastised her for what she'd done, and even though I was angry and disappointed by her actions, I couldn't help but feel relieved that nothing worse had happened to her. She had dodged a bullet, but I was honestly worried about what would have happened if she had stayed in that situation any longer. At the end of the day, we were just grateful she got out before things escalated any further. Story 11. My best friend in high school had a brother who was only a year older than her. I wasn't close friends with him or anything, but I always liked him when we were younger in a friendly way. He was always goofy and seemed kind-hearted, even though he consistently stayed in trouble as a teen. He has had a serious drinking problem ever since middle school. I knew he had some demons, but I never thought he was a bad guy. Well, anyway, I lost touch with my friend for a few years after high school. But when we ran into each other a while back, we had a long catch-up session. While talking, I couldn't help but notice that she hadn't mentioned her brother at all. That is odd, considering that he has always been present in her life. So, I asked about him. Apparently, her brother had essayed a boy when he was in his mid-20s. The boy's family found out about it and pressed charges against him. I was absolutely shocked. I knew he had some serious emotional issues, and I knew he had been dealing with substance abuse, but I never thought he would do something like that. At most, I imagined him being in and out of jail for random, petty drug-related charges, or maybe even go to prison for a drug-related felony charge. I never thought this was the direction his life would take. My friend said that she thinks his issues make it extremely difficult to have healthy relationships with people his own age, that he feels safer socializing with people much, much younger. She told me that after the charges were pressed, he was an absolute wreck, as if he were going through a breakup with another adult. It wasn't the charges that bothered him. It was the fact that he seriously considered this kid to be his boyfriend, and he didn't want to lose him. Not that this makes anything he did less messed up. It was just shocking to me to hear just how warped this guy I grew up with was, and I never knew it. All this time, you think you know a guy? Story 12. Alright, this is going to be a long one, but a lot of context is needed, along with some really ugly truths I discovered along the way. About 6 to 7 years ago, I found myself in a tough housing situation. I live in a city where housing is extremely expensive and hard to come by, and I had just learned that the letting agency was renovating my apartment, meaning they were kicking me and my flatmate, who I couldn't stand out. I posted an ad looking for new flatmates, and this guy responded, asking to meet up to see if we could make something work. I recognized him from anime conventions, not exactly a great start, I know, and I chatted with him a few times, had a few drinks together, and we were Facebook friends. He had been close friends with some people I knew really well. So, we sit down for Chinese food, and he starts telling me about his mental health, saying he experiences dissociative episodes where he wakes up not knowing where he's been or what he's done. He mentioned once waking up with blood on his hands and not knowing how it got there. I gave him a smile and said something like, "Yeah, that doesn't sound great, man." While inside I was screaming, "I am not moving in with this guy." A few weeks later, some of my friends referenced an incident at another anime con involving this guy, but wouldn't go into details. Apparently, there was an ongoing investigation. I wasn't shocked, given the vibe I was getting from him, but I didn't think much of it at the time. A few years later, I get a message from someone else I knew telling me to unfriend this guy because he had just been convicted of violently raping a girl at knife point at an anime con in a side room and had been sentenced. Suddenly, everything made sense. I talked to my mutual friends who had known him since they were teenagers, and they opened up. They had been really close to him, and when the incident happened, he told them that the girl was lying and that he was innocent. They wanted to believe him, cautiously, until the trial happened, and that's when they learned the horrifying truth. The trial revealed indisputable evidence of his guilt. He had been found with a bag containing a knife, rope, duct tape, everything you would expect from someone planning something awful. What made it worse was that the girl he attacked wasn't even his intended target. His real target was one of my friend's girlfriends, whom he had been obsessed with, believing she had been leading him on after a long dry spell. He had even thought about offing her. I don't know the victim, but I can't even imagine the trauma she endured. For my friends, learning that someone they had known and trusted for so long was capable of such violence was devastating. The whole thing really gave me a first-hand view of how traumatic and complicated situations like this can be. One of the girls who knew him and couldn't believe he'd do something like this received anonymous threats afterward because some people thought she was denying his guilt. Screw that guy. He's in jail now, where he belongs. It's also a reminder that, sometimes, situations like this bring out the worst in people. Story 13. I found out after 24.5 years my mother brainwashed me into believing my father sawed me and my brother. I didn't find out until I went to jail for a 10-month sentence and decided to start over in another state with my father and reconnect and give him a chance. He showed me all the court documents about how the judge dismissed the case due to it being obvious me and my brother were coached. It said in the court documents that me and my brother had admitted to my mom telling us what to say, and our stories didn't add up. I was like 11, so I didn't remember much, and my mom was very manipulative. She told me she had dropped the charges so she could save us from a grueling trial, but the papers clearly state otherwise, and that she's a liar. So, after 14 years I reunited with my father and found out the truth. She made me hate my father growing up and kept us away with his parents, and I never got to see them before they passed. And she still denies everything. Story 14. I hope this all makes sense because it honestly feels like something straight out of a midday soap opera. Names have been changed for privacy. My parents have been married for over 30 years, and about 10 years ago, when I was 27, I found out something that completely rocked my world. My mom had been married to another man when she was 19 and had a daughter with him. That daughter is my half-sister, Claire, who my parents pretended didn't exist at all. I had no idea she even existed. At the same time, I discovered that my eldest brother, Sam, is also my half-brother. Sam left home when I was young, and I don't have many memories of him. He came back into our lives when I was 16, but after an argument with my parents when I was 18, we never heard from him again. Looking back, it all made sense now. My parents were always especially hard on him. I don't blame him for cutting ties with them. I learned all of this when my half-sister, Claire, reached out to my other brother, Peter, on Facebook and straight up told him that she was our half-sister. Peter was furious, and it led to Mom and Dad finally coming clean to us. Their excuse? They were trying to protect us. Honestly, I think they just never intended to tell us at all. Mom casually mentioned that Sam was also her first husband's son, and I responded, "Wait, Sam is my half-brother?" She replied with a dismissive, "Well, duh." She even started crying, and at the time, I comforted her, but looking back, the past 10 years have been really hard on me. I don't trust my parents anymore, and our relationship is strained. Claire lived with my nan from the time she was 4. When Mom got together with Dad, they tolerated Sam, but they didn't want Claire around. She ran away a few times before my nan took her in. I didn't even meet my nan until I was 18, and I only saw her once more before she passed away. I didn't know any of this before Nan's death, and now I understand why Mom kept her distance from Nan and Pop when I was growing up. My parents like to act like everything is fine, but I've never fully recovered from what I learned. My mom's texts make me anxious. I moved 2 hours away 8 years ago, and they've never once offered to visit. Yet, they expect me to visit every Christmas and every couple of months, with Mom guilt-tripping me when I don't. I've barely spoken to anyone about this, other than my therapist. My heart is honestly racing as I write this, but thanks to anyone who's read it this far. Story 15. My cousin dropped out of college with a full-ride football scholarship and a bright future to stand by his then-girlfriend, now wife, after she accused the star quarterback of SA. The school investigated and said nothing happened, but he believed her and sacrificed everything. Several years later, and after having a baby, she admitted it was all a lie. She had actually slept with the quarterback and didn't want to admit she'd been unfaithful. Then, she left him for a while, claiming she felt like she missed out on fun by getting married so young and wanted to party with her college friends. She didn't want a divorce, just needed some time to live it up, while my cousin supported their child alone. Eventually, she came back into the picture. That's when things took a darker turn. She reported a series of domestic assaults and got a restraining order against him, presenting photos of her injuries as evidence. The case went to pre-trial hearings, but the charges were dropped when the photos were revealed to be fakes. The injuries shown in the photos didn't line up, like a black eye switching sides of her face and shifting positions within a day or two. In court, she admitted everything was a lie, but even after all of that, she kept trying to get him to visit while the restraining order was still valid, which he wisely ignored. Fast forward to now, 6 months later, and I find out she dropped the restraining order and they're back together. I guess her party-loving friends have all started settling down with families, and she feels left behind, so now he's back on her radar as a viable life option. He accepted her back, and now they're expecting a second child. The worst part is that his parents took out loans and paid over $15,000 to help him navigate the court system, and now, both of them have chosen to stop speaking to his parents after they asked him to help repay the loans due to his decision to stay in this situation. Story 16. I spent 10 years with my ex-partner, raising his kids and having a child together. 18 months after we separated, I found out he had been having an affair with another mom from the kids' school for about 2 years, continuing for years after that. I messaged her, and she told me that when we first started at the school, he had told everyone, including her, that I was his live-in au pair, not his partner. So, for a decade, our entire community watched us living as a couple, and no one said a word about his affair. I worked at the school as a teacher and counselor, and not one of my friends ever mentioned it to me. The woman told me that when we announced we were expecting, she confronted him, and he claimed we had just gotten together. She said he would bring the kids I was raising to family picnics, spend a lot of money on her kids, and even take family photos and go on vacations with them. So, his kids were keeping the secret from me too. What the hell? Around 4 years into the relationship, he proposed to me in front of his kids, claiming that his divorce had finally gone through. The truth was, he was still married to his first wife. When I confronted him, he admitted everything and said that he was still very close friends with his ex-wife and spoke to her weekly. He even told me he was upset because she moved to another state when we had our daughter, which broke his heart. Who freaking who? For years, I thought I must have been incredibly naive and stupid. But as I got older, I realized it's normal to trust and love your partner, especially when they are close with your family. Some people, though, are just liars and filthy cheaters, and they do that to anyone. Story 17. In university, I was part of a tight-knit friend group. We had regular gatherings and dinner parties every Friday with the goal of living in an intentional community. Some members were budding activists, heavily involved in local issues related to race and LGBTQ discrimination. We had an open-door policy and pooled resources to help anyone in need. One of my coworkers, who was really struggling, told me she had been kicked out of her house for being a lesbian. I told her about our group, and we all welcomed her with open arms, offering support however we could. I spoke with my mom and arranged for this girl to stay in my old room at her house rent-free until she got back on her feet. Around this time, she was also grieving her grandma's declining health and eventual passing. A few weeks into the arrangement, my mom called me, saying this girl needed to leave because things were not working out. This caused a huge rift in the friend group. The girl accused my mom of being homophobic and kicking her out without cause. As a result, I was essentially pushed out of the group, with only a few people staying in contact with me because they knew my mom and felt something was off. I went home to find my old room completely trashed. The girl had left it in absolute filth, garbage bags everywhere, dishes thrown in the trash instead of being washed. On top of that, she was using drugs and drinking heavily, to the point of verbally abusing my mom. I was shocked. The girl begged not to be kicked out, so we gave her until the end of the month to leave. My grandfather and someone from the group helped her pack up and move out, and I went by to help clean. While cleaning, I found several checks in the name of her late grandma. Checks she had been using to buy expensive art supplies. We contacted her family and learned the real reason she had been kicked out wasn't because she was gay, but because she had been stealing from her sick grandma, whom she had been entrusted to care for. She had been committing major fraud, using her grandma's social security number to collect money while her grandma was still alive. We reported her for fraud, and later I found out through a mutual friend that she had a serious drug problem. I tried to share this with the group, but they didn't believe me, except for one person who had experience with an addict and recognized the signs. I was heartbroken, losing many friends who continued to label my mom's actions as hateful because the girl had gotten to them first. It was especially painful because this group was committed to having anti-racist discussions on our campus. They were mostly white, with me being the only Caribbean person, and I'm also queer, non-binary. It felt ironic and a bit sickening that the person kicked out of this so-called inclusive space was someone from the very demographic they claimed to want to support. Story 18. A friend of mine slept with her boyfriend's best friend when she was incredibly drunk, and I have a suspicion that her third child might be his, not her boyfriend's. She and her boyfriend already have 2 kids together, but this third child looks much more like the boyfriend's friend than the boyfriend. The first 2 kids have brown eyes and hair like both parents, while the third one has blue eyes and red hair, just like the other guy. She's a childhood friend, though we don't see each other much. When she told me about what happened, I did encourage her to tell her boyfriend. She mentioned it to me while she was heavily pregnant, so I think she started to realize that there was a possibility the child might not be her boyfriend's. It definitely only happened once. She never implied that it was forced, but she used to be the kind of person who couldn't control her drinking and often ended up in situations like that when we were teenagers. From what I gathered, both of them were incredibly drunk at the time. The reason I haven't said anything is because their relationship is already pretty weird. I don't know him well enough, and I don't think it would do any good. They're in a relationship, but they don't act like a couple, and they don't live together. Her boyfriend doesn't really contribute much to their 2 confirmed kids either. At one point, he was making good money while she was struggling to get by and barely had clothes that weren't falling apart. I'm not really sure why they're together, but they are. It's even public on his social media. Around the time the third child was born, his dad passed away, and while I don't think her boyfriend cheats, it's just a strange situation all around. Even though I'm very much against cheating, I feel like it's not my place to stir things up. Nothing's been confirmed about paternity, and I haven't been in contact with either of them for a few years now. But every time I see that child, I can't help but remember what she told me. Story 19. I had a best friend for 7 years. We had been through everything together. When I moved out of state with my now husband, she convinced us to move back a year later so we could be closer to her. Since we didn't have any strong ties to the new state, we thought, why not? She was basically family. For a while, it was perfect. She was over almost every night for dinner. We laughed, talked, and made amazing memories. It was one of the best years of my life. Then, slowly, things started to shift. She began trying to turn my husband and me against each other. Anytime we argued, like any couple does, she would text both of us separately, validating each of our sides, subtly fueling the tension between us. With me, she talked about a plan B, that if my marriage didn't work out, I could move in with her and we could have a happy life together. With my husband, she started bringing up her infertility issues, telling him she wanted a child just like him. She just needed a donor. All of this happened around the same time, and when my husband and I compared texts, it became horrifyingly clear what was going on. She wanted to have his child and build a life with me. When we confronted her, she refused to admit anything and instead lashed out at both of us. Things escalated quickly. She started showing up unannounced, pounding on our door, demanding a place in our home. It became so terrifying that we had to move and change our phone numbers just to escape her. I think what makes it so disturbing is that she was the best friend I had ever had, only to realize that she cared about me in a way that was unhealthy, obsessive, and deeply unsettling. But hey, my husband and I are doing great now. Story 20. I'm not sure how disturbing this is. It turned out beautifully for one person, but not for another. I was adopted and raised on a whimsical, magical story about my birth parents, one that never quite felt true, even as a child. At 57, I finally uncovered the reality. I was the result of a college affair between a deeply religious Jewish young man and a devout Baptist woman. When she became pregnant, her family sent her away to a home for wayward girls, far from where they lived. My father followed her there, desperate to keep me and build a life together. But both families refused. In the mid-60s, Jewish people weren't widely considered white, and her family adamantly opposed the idea of her marrying someone outside their race. On top of that, she was a committed Christian and unwilling to convert to Judaism. And so, I was given to another family. Recently, I discovered 3 wonderful half-siblings. We're all musicians, some professional, some semi-pro, and we get along effortlessly. Unfortunately, I never got to meet my birth mother. She passed away a year before I began searching. My father, on the other hand, is still alive but wants nothing to do with me. And that's okay. I'm grateful for the love he once had for me. It was enough. But not all stories end this way. Someone else in my adoptive family was also adopted. She was older than me, and, later in life, she too sought out her birth mother. What she found was devastating. Her mother had been institutionalized since birth, suffering from profound physical, mental, cognitive, and sensory disabilities. She had been essayed by an orderly, and that's how she was conceived. Not every search leads to a happy ending. Story 21. A former work colleague of mine once made national headlines for living a life built on fraudulent qualifications. He claimed to have medical and law degrees, held the rank of brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was even the CEO of a major health fund. While he was legitimately a brigadier, both that role and his high-profile career were largely built on a web of lies. Each job he landed was based on fake credentials, allowing him to climb higher and higher. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew the truth. He had acquired his fraudulent degrees while working in Army Reserves recruiting, where he had access to submitted job applications. For years, no one questioned him. But his downfall came when he applied for a government position. The recruitment team noticed some red flags, and when they started digging, the deception unraveled. Realizing he was caught, he tried to withdraw his application, only to learn too late that applying for a government role carries the same legal weight as a statutory declaration. Once submitted, it couldn't be undone. Everything collapsed almost instantly, and in the end, he served jail time. Story 22. Growing up, I was pretty close with my youngest uncle, at least in pictures. For context, he was in his mid-20s when I was around 5. Then, one day when I was in middle school, he just disappeared. Stopped coming around completely. When we asked about him, the family told us kids that he was off backpacking across the country. Years later, in high school, I was working on a genealogy project about my grandfather, his dad, when I accidentally stumbled across my uncle's name on the offender registry. That's how I found out the truth. He had been running a kiddie corn ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. Now he's out, and my family acts like it never happened. I stay far away. Story 23. While my cousin was out walking in the woods with her son one day when he came across a hunting stand. Curious, she climbed up and found a pair of binoculars. She sat facing forward, lifted them to her eyes, and saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here. If it was a legitimate hunting stand, it was illegally placed way too close to a residence and had to come down. If it was a Peeping Tom setup, well, it definitely had to come down. Not long after, my brother and I visited. She showed us where it was. We ripped it apart, bent it, wrapped it around a few trees, and made sure it was completely unusable. The next day, I got an angry call. "Did you tear down a hunting stand yesterday?" "Hell yeah, I did." "That was your uncle's." Her mother's brother. Turns out, my cousin had reported it to the family, and they just ignored it. When confronted, our uncle claimed it was just an old treehouse. Even after he was exposed, no one cared. They were more upset about the damage we did than the fact that he was spying on his own niece. Suffice it to say, I've written off most of that side of the family. Story 24. I found out when I was an adult that my mother didn't just abandon me one day after work like I had been led to believe. Turns out she had been raped. She said they took her wallet and made a disgusting comment about my picture inside. I would have been a toddler at this time, and she was just too scared to go home. She said they followed her. She said when it was over, and my stepdad took her to the hospital, they had to stitch everything back together down there. She spent that time away on and off the psych ward. My mom and I still have a rocky relationship for reasons beyond this, but I definitely understand her better. She's had issues with drinking and her mental health all my life, and I really think it's because she's never sought proper help for what happened to her. Underneath all that trauma, drinking, and grief is my mother, and she's one of the most beautiful souls that'll ever walk this earth. For clarification, she stayed in my life, just my grandparents raised me. There were a lot of other drama as well, but none of it worth getting into. Story 25. I found out that my own mother bribed my social services worker to make my life a living hell. I was in foster care from 11 to 18 because she was mistreating me. Despite being under the state's protection, I was suddenly imprisoned for no reason and had to endure various forms of torture or revenge. At 16, I finally hired a lawyer who uncovered all the evidence and took it to court. As a result, my mother lost what little legal custody she still had. The social services worker was fired and banned from the profession, and I was granted emancipation. The judge was not pleased. Now, at 41, she still tries to make my life miserable whenever she gets the chance, even if I move away. I can't wait for the day she's gone so I can finally live in peace. Story 26. My extended family on my mom's side has this odd habit of turning traumatic family events into jokes at gatherings, mostly as a way to cope with the pain. Stories like the time my grandfather tried to shoot my grandmother in their living room with the kids there, or when my mom got beaten for saying Billy D. Williams was attractive, were told at Christmas parties, even when I was a kid. The only things that aren't turned into funny stories are the ones no one knows how to handle, the ones they just want to bury. And those are the things I've only gotten tiny glimpses of, probably for the best. The one that stands out the most is when my grandmother casually mentioned that my grandfather was in the KKK and was really proud of how good he was at it. Or when I later realized the only reason I saw him growing up and none of my cousins did was because he knew where my mom lived, but not his other kids. Visiting wasn't optional for us. That does explain a lot, though, especially when I think back to how strange his house was. It was bizarre, like hanging out with the mute grandkids of his new wife, who played with Unalive rats dressed in Barbie clothes in a dollhouse made of reclaimed driftwood. That level of weird. Story 27. When I was about 4, my mom traveled back to China to terminate pregnancy. My parents hoped I was too young to remember, but I did. I recall her visiting the doctor multiple times for ultrasounds and other checkups. Then, she left for several months, leaving just my dad and me in the U.S. When she came back, she never mentioned it again. I asked her where the little sister who was supposed to be born went, and they just told me she disappeared. As a teenager, after learning about intimacy, pregnancy, and abortion, I started to suspect what had happened. I asked her about it, and she denied it, claiming it never happened and that I must be imagining things, classic gaslighting. Over 30 years later, I finally asked my uncle about it, and he confirmed everything. He said my mom did indeed terminate the pregnancy, and that her sister and my grandma helped take care of her afterward. My parents were poor immigrants living on my dad's small grad school stipend, and we lived in a very conservative state, so an abortion was something they couldn't afford. The reason for the termination was that the baby had severe birth defects and wasn't going to survive. Story 28. Growing up, I had an estranged sister from my dad's first marriage, but no one ever really explained why she left. The reasons were always vague, and I never got the full picture. When my brother passed away when I was around 12, a relative made an effort to reach out to her and invite her to the funeral. She called the house, and my dad took the phone call privately. Afterward, he came out of the room and told us that he was done with her. He said she had been nasty to him on the phone and wasn't coming to the funeral. I was hurt and confused. I had always wanted to meet my sister, and I couldn't understand why she would treat my grieving father that way. Fast forward to when I was 19. I was visiting a relative in Ireland, the same one who had reached out to my sister all those years ago. We were at a bar, drinking and talking, and she accidentally let something slip. She told me she had actually been with my sister that day when she made the phone call, and it was my father who had been the one to be nasty to her, making her cry in a coffee shop. My sister had packed her bags, ready to go to my brother's funeral, but she never went because of how my dad treated her. I was furious, completely blindsided and betrayed by the truth. I still haven't spoken to my sister, but the whole thing has left me with so much anger and hurt. Now, my father has 2 estranged children, and I'm left trying to figure out how everything went so wrong. Story 29. I have almost no contact with my extended family. They mean nothing to me. I keep my mom, dad, and one brother close, but the rest are either toxic or indifferent towards me. I've learned the hard way not to trust people, and I've lost money, time, and mental peace because of them. I'm done. Losing touch with them doesn't bother me at all. They have shown me nothing but disrespect and allowed terrible things to happen to my father, their brother. When my grandfather passed away, they continued to mistreat my father, knowing full well it was out of spite because he was a stepson, not their full brother. My step-grandfather had all his wealth, and the house left to my grandmother to care for my father, but she died when I was 8. All the money that was supposed to support my father was left to her husband, and when he passed, the will provided for all the grandkids and their children, but not my family. We didn't get a penny, even though that money was meant for us. He didn't work, he lived off that inheritance, and the house wasn't paid for by him. It was all money left to my father so his mother could care for him. Then, years later, they had the audacity to reach out and ask if we could let bygones be bygones. No, you fostered hate, and the money you took was meant for my father's care, from his true family. Your father was nothing more than a usurper who stole my father's inheritance. Story 30. My soon-to-be ex-husband lied about having cancer twice, and he did it to cover up his affairs. The first time, he guilted me into believing he had to leave town for treatment because I was too weak to handle it, and he needed to save his strength to fight cancer, not take care of me. I hated myself for being weak. It turns out he was actually out of town with someone else while I stayed home, being a single mom for 6 months. He fooled our friends and family, even telling his boss that he had days to weeks to live. I have texts from a friend of his where he talks about barfing from chemo, but the dates matched up to when we were at a hotel together, enjoying a romantic long weekend. He didn't tell me the cancer returned until a month later, but the truth is, he never had cancer at all. He was never even tested for it. He let me, our children, and our families cry, worry, and suffer over a diagnosis that was a complete lie. Twice. I'll never get over how unbearably cruel that was. Story 31. Last year, while I was having drinks with my grandparents, I brought up how odd it was that my aunt had all this Christian/Jesus-related stuff. I had noticed she was wearing a hoodie that said something like, "Choose Christ," which confused me because both she and my uncle are pretty secular. That's when my grandma accidentally let something slip. Oh, she got baptized after she ran over that man. And just like that, the secret was out. Apparently, my aunt ran over a drunk guy on Halloween. He and his friends were jumping out in front of cars, trying to scare people as part of the holiday fun. She couldn't stop in time, and he ended up partially through her windshield. What followed was a terrible situation, made worse by the racial aspect. She got off without any charges because she's white, while the man she hit was Pacific Islander. His family fought for justice, but they never got it. It's a really crappy situation, and I feel for everyone involved. I love my aunt deeply, but this was a dark family secret I never knew about until that moment. Story 32. I still don't know if this was true or not, but what I found seemed to coincide with what happened. A few years back, I was living with my then-boyfriend, now ex. The relationship itself was not great. He was quite clearly mentally unwell, but refused to seek additional help, and as a result was a bit emotionally abusive and neglectful toward me. One night we were talking about nothing in particular, but he decided he was going to open up to me. Part of me believes this was a manipulation tactic, but I'm not so sure anymore. He had loosely admitted to offing someone for essaying his sister. I can definitely understand why someone would do that, but again, I'm unsure if this was true. He definitely knew I was afraid of him, though, because he had threatened to hit me previously. So, knowing this didn't make me feel safe. It made my fear of him even worse. One day, I went onto his computer while he was at work to look for a game to transfer over to my computer via LAN cable. We didn't have access to the internet. While looking up game files, I came across downloaded books and many documents on how to hide a body, the best way to off someone, how to build bombs, and a copy of the Anarchist's Handbook. I confronted him about it and told him that I don't feel safe knowing he has these. He responded with, "I'm keeping them, and I don't really care about you, myself, or anyone around me." We broke up on the spot, and he moved out shortly after. I also find it really strange that as soon as he moved out, my little gray cat had gone missing. I can only hope that it was a coincidence, but I never found him. On the plus side, 2 years ago a stray cat wandered into my yard. I gave him a piece of steak, and he's never left my side since. He's sleeping on my chest as I type this. Story 33. When my stepmom and dad first got married, she cheated on him multiple times. She'd tell him she was taking trips with her girlfriends to their family condo in Florida, but in reality, she was meeting up with guys she was chatting with online. She confided in my aunt, my dad's sister, and told her some of what happened, but when my aunt eventually told my dad, my stepmom didn't speak to her for a long time, acting as if she was supposed to keep it a secret from her own brother. I lost all respect for her. I only refer to her by her first name and keep things coldly polite. Honestly, I also lost a bit of respect for my dad when they stayed together. I know part of it is because he feels like he's stuck with her, especially since he ended up raising my stepsister, whose bio dad was completely absent. When they're not around, my family talks about her behind her back, and no one likes her. We just tolerate her because she's married to my dad. She's toxic and treats him terribly, and I really can't stand her for it. If my dad passes before her, she'll know how much contempt I have for her. Story 34. A few years ago, I was part of a regular D&D group with some people my partner met through work. Even after he left his job, we continued playing with them for several months. One night, a member we'll call G didn't show up. No call, no text, nothing. A few days later, he messaged the group, apologizing and saying he'd be back next time. At the next session, G, who lived within walking distance of us, asked if he could hang out after the game. We agreed. After chatting for a bit, he asked if we wanted to know why he had missed the last session. First, though, he made us promise not to tell anyone. We agreed. Then he told us he had been at the police station because they had confiscated his phone and laptop. When we asked why, he said it was because they found kitty corn on them. We asked how they got there, and he admitted he had looked them up himself. He claimed he had never hurt anyone, but that since he couldn't afford therapy recently, he had looked it up and was then detained by police for it. We were stunned, unsure how to respond. The conversation drifted into the cost of therapy, how free online counseling isn't designed for cases like his, and how those services drop people with complicated issues. Eventually, he went home. My partner and I sat in silence, feeling like we had concrete pressing on our chests. We could finally breathe again, but the weight of what we had just learned lingered. We discussed what to do. While we hadn't immediately told G that we were uncomfortable, it was clear we couldn't look at him the same way. Eventually, we contacted him and said we weren't comfortable being around him anymore and asked him to leave our D&D group. We assured him we wouldn't tell anyone what he had shared, but we didn't want to see him again. He agreed. For a long time after, I felt deeply unsettled, especially when I was home alone. He had been in our house. He knew where we lived. He was close. At the time, I wasn't close to anyone with kids, but the thought of knowing someone like that and having no idea was profoundly disturbing. One thing that kept coming to my mind was that he had a kid. A fairly young kid, single digits. The thought of someone like that having joint custody of a kid was also incredibly overwhelming. I knew the police were aware and that would likely affect his visitation, but it still creeped me right out. We eventually finished the campaign and remained somewhat distant friends with the group, but like I promised him, I still didn't tell them about G. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, but it's hard to know how he would have reacted if I had outed his secret. I don't live in that house anymore, but my parents do. I'm glad to be further away from him, but I also try to think of him as little as possible. The fact you can never tell which people feel that way is still a terrifying thought, though. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.